3 minutes past now, so I think we're going to make a start. Hi everyone, welcome to this FCI webinar on electronic health records and clinical trials. Just got a quick housekeeping slide up here, which hopefully you can see. If you could all keep yourself muted, apart from until the Q&A section, that would be great. You can do that with the panel here, and there's some shortcuts there as well. Please do ask questions in the chat as the presentations are going on, and we'll pick them up at the Q&A at the end. And we are currently recording as well the webinar, and it'll be published on the faculty website afterwards for everyone to see. We're aware there has been some problems previously with people not having access to chat or hands up. If that's the case, then I apologise. We'll try and sort that out in the future. I think it may be to do with accessing things on the browser, or to do with using Safari or Firefox browsers as well. So if you're able to use Chrome or Edge, then that has seemed to work better, but hopefully it should be all right for this session. And yeah, I'll pass on to you, Paul, if that's all right.
Thanks very much, Joe. Good afternoon, everyone. I see, colleagues are all joining. Grateful to have you join us today for another one in the series of the faculty webinars. We've been running a series of webinars now covering a range of topics, such artificial intelligence, medical devices, data ethics and standards, an upcoming one on how to fix national clinical safety. So, a really interesting range of webinar topics which have been very well contributed to by members, so grateful for all your input there. And today we can do the same. You can ask any questions in the chat here, and we'll have a question and answer session at the end, or you can use the raise your hand feature, as Joe said. Today's topic is integrating electronic health records, and we are delighted to have two real experts in this area, in this field, who are going to tell us of their experiences, particular experiences in a project that they've been working in, and then really open up the topic to discussion, and I'm sure the presentation will lead to some questions. So first of all, we have Keong. Keong is a consultant hematologist, a clinical, if I got it right, clinical research information officer down in London, and many of you will know Keong's name, I'm quite sure, from many years in many formats in the clinical informatics space. Involved in lots of the national standard stuff and setting up, one of the original guys that helped set up the CCIO network. So a strong history of involvement there, and Keong is going to lead off. Just also briefly to introduce Jay. Jay has been also a medical clinical informatics consultant for about 15 years, got a medical background himself, and is, I think they've been working very closely together. So with that, I'm going to hand over now to Keong, and they're going to take us through this presentation. Please ask some questions, and we'll take that on to the end as well. So thanks very much. Over to yourself, Keong.
Thanks, Paul. So thanks for the opportunity to present. So just a quick additional introduction to myself. So I'm a hematologist, as Paul says, and also Chief Research Information Officer at UCLH. Some people ask me, what does a Chief Research Information Officer do? In 30 seconds, I tell people I do three things. I try to help implement digital technologies to help with the clinical trial process. I try to make data that is routinely collected in the electronic health record systems available for service improvement and research purposes. And with the advent of a fully integrated digital health record at UCLH, we want to see how we could use the digital platform to do more innovation around research, especially around digital research. So I guess this particular talk focuses on the first one, which is how to use digital technologies to support the clinical trial process. So Jay, I think you were going to share the slides, and I was going to drive it. Yeah.
Jay, you're on mute.
Sorry, if I could just briefly introduce myself as well. Thanks, Paul. So I used to be a doctor a long time ago. I don't write doctor anymore because I haven't seen patients in 15 years. So you shouldn't take clinical advice from me at all. And that's why we've got Keong here, and you yourselves, obviously. I think for the past 15 years, I've actually just been doing health informatics and writing software code, building production systems. And I think my last gig was actually leading the England National Pathology Standards work, which I was actually doing up until a couple of months ago. Before that, I worked in other national programs in Singapore, Sweden, UK as well. And generally, my area of expertise is healthcare standards and SNOMED and other things. The kind of things that people kind of say, yeah, sounds good, but well, let's just move on. So if I could then start sharing my screen and do it the clever way that I've just been taught. So just bear with me. Okay, so
if I just start just by talking about, basically we're here to share me and Jay's experience about developing a trials discovery platform called Key Trials, and how we've kind of implemented clinical informatics principles into this process. Jay, I think you may not have shared the PowerPoint properly, because unless you want to advance the slides for me.
I think what you need to do is just take control, isn't it?
No, it doesn't work. It's all right. We practiced earlier. Do you just want to follow to the next? Do you just want to follow to the next slide?
Okay.
So
yeah, sorry.
really, this whole key trial started with a conversation that I had with my colleague on a ward round on the hematology ward. So he runs a lot of phase 1, phase 2 trials at UCLH, and he constantly gets queries from his colleagues either by phone or email. Do you have something for my 35-year-old patient with relapsed follicular lymphoma? And then he spends a lot of time replying emails, and this is kind of repeated across a lot of my other colleagues. Next slide, please, Jay.
Yep. Here we go.
And why is it important to make sure that you can discover studies for patients? I think there's something about equitable access. I work in a tertiary referral center. We literally got hundreds of trials in cancer, for example, but this may not be the case if you are work in a referring hospital or in general practice. Having trials that are open is part of equitable access for patients. It's also important for transparency purposes. The NIHR literally spends millions every single year supporting studies. We need to ensure that we are demonstrating value for the taxpayers, and following from that also, with better transparency and publicity, better recruitment into studies. Jay, next. So you may ask, and this is the first question that a lot of my colleagues ask, what about existing websites or platforms where you can find out about clinical trials and studies that are open? For example, clinicaltrials.gov, and the NIHR owns Gateway. It used to be called Gateway, but it's now called Be Part of Research. What we found is that, and really this is not so much a technology problem, but more a kind of people process issue, is that they're not necessarily up to date. In fact, there are some studies, especially early phase ones, which may be open and closed before it even reaches one of the more publicly available websites. And they don't tend to contain, local contact details. So you still don't know who to contact if you want to find out more. They don't have notifications, so you can't get an email when something opens in a particular area of interest to you. None of them integrate with EHR. So if I have a patient in front of me with a diagnosis of lung cancer, for example, I'll have to type in lung cancer again in the external website, and it's just not next to me on my screen. And of course, these are all generic websites, and there's no ability for you to customize it for your own organization or disease group or geographical region. And everyone wants an app nowadays. So next slide, Jay. Now, because, you might think at this stage, so we'll write another website. It's not hard. You can go onto wix.com and write yourself a website. But we had a few additional requirements. And these are requirements where we bring in kind of software engineering principles and clinical informatics principles to try to solve this problem. And because all of this is kind of publicly funded as well, we were quite keen that it's done in an open source way. So it is all our code is open source, and we've applied SNOMED CT informatics principles, as you would see, and also HL7 standards. We've created a platform, so writing a mobile app on top of it is much more straightforward, and it needs to have it to be easily maintained. If I got my R&D staff to keep a register of open studies in the R&D system and do exactly the same in this platform, it will never happen. So it needs to have some form of integration with the R&D system as well. Next. So I thought actually the easiest thing to do is to just demonstrate what we have created, and through that, hopefully you could see how it works. So I'm just going to share my screen now. Jay, can you stop sharing? And then, oh, I can, yeah, thanks, perfect. Hey, let me find the right, I think this is the one. Okay, so this is how it looks like at the moment. This is not the actual live website. As you can see, it stands for user acceptance testing, and find the studies and implementation of our technology at UCLH. So so I'll just go straight into the main screen. So you can see at the moment we only have much less than the normal number of studies open because of COVID. On the left-hand side here, you could see all the disease categories, the different phases that you can easily filter on. And on the right-hand side here, you could see the titles of the studies. Now, here you can search very quickly. So if I start typing lung, you could see how fast that search is. But this search is actually only a free text search. So for example, if lung cancer will only find lung if you have lung in the title, but it doesn't understand, for example, that a particular study is actually related to lung cancer at all. So if I just demonstrate something else that we have is something called semantic search. So this is where we have actually applied clinical informatics principles to it. So for example, if I just do that and I type lung cancer here, what I'm actually doing here is that I'm actually searching by SNOMED CT. And what it did was that it found all the studies that have the concept of lung cancer associated to it with it. And to demonstrate this in more detail, there's this toggle here that includes ancestors. What this means is that if there was a study that is not just about lung cancer, but just cancer in general, it should also find it, because in SNOMED CT, it will hold that the hierarchical relationship that lung cancer is a type of cancer. So let's hope this demonstration works. So I do that, and you can see it's increased to 13 now. And you can see a typical one up here, a new study on COVID, natural history and outcomes of cancer patients during the COVID-19 epidemic. Notice there's no lung cancer written anywhere here, but it knows that if your patient has lung cancer, it may be included into on COVID or the piece and so on and so forth. So this is just to demonstrate that by applying clinical informatics principles to clinical trials, we bring a whole new level of functionality and sophistication that can't be kind of made before. The other thing I also want to demonstrate is the notification. So here, so let's say you're particularly interested in lung cancer. You can just save this search, and this search is then saved for in your particular profile. And then what you have is that when a new study opens that fulfill this particular criteria, then you will get an email showing it. The other thing you could do is also input your patient's age in here. So my guess is that if I put something like, if I have a 14-year-old patient, you could see the number of studies go down quite dramatically because a lot of studies don't tend to be for adolescents. So that's another kind of additional functionality to demonstrate. Right. So I think in terms of the demonstration, I'll stop here, and we can always come back to how this might look like later on. So I'm just going to flip back into stop sharing this and flip back into the other presentation. So Jay, if you want to do that again, please. Jay, I think you're on mute.
Yep, sorry, I was just doing my usual thing while I was on mute. Okay, yeah.
All right.
Are you sure you're not able to take control now?
Now I can. Yeah.
Okay, go for it.
Okay, so this is just an example of how one of these notifications look like. Now, the other thing I want to demonstrate as well, and we talked about earlier, is this thing called EHR integration. Now, one of the powers of having SNOMED CT driving the search behind the scenes for our platform is the ability to then integrate this with electronic health record systems, because electronic health record systems tend to use standards like SNOMED CT and ICD-10 in the way it records information as well. Now, while this is quite standard practice in EHRs, it's definitely not standard practice in clinical trials, which is why we think this is quite unique. So what you see here is a screenshot of an EHR at UCLH called EPIC. And this is a fake patient, and we have given the patient a diagnosis of lung cancer, and associated with this diagnosis is a SNOMED CT term, a concept, and also an ICD-10 concept. So what actually happens is that if I right-click on lung cancer and click something called Search Active Guidelines, it actually shows within EPIC itself and all the studies that has lung cancer associated with it. And it's also pulled the patient's age across, as I've demonstrated earlier. So here, then you get a short list of studies that your patient might be suitable for. Jay will go into a lot more detail about the technology behind the scenes that can show this integration and how it's done. So at this stage, I'm going to stop presenting, and Jay is going to take us through the underlying informatics principles and the software engineering that was required to do what I've shown you so far.
Thanks, Keong. Can everybody hear me? I assume you can. Okay, so
yeah.
If at any point, if I speak too fast or you can't hear me, then let me know. I'm using a dodgy Bluetooth, earphones, so they could play up at some point. So here's the thing. I always love when Keong sets up the scene this way, because he tells the actual clinical story and says, here's what we are able to do now, as opposed to what we couldn't do before, right? And of course, then everybody says, yes, but how long did it take it for you guys to do it? And of course, what can I do with it? So I think in some ways, the rest of this presentation, or part of it, most of it, would be to actually explain how did we go about doing it, how you could probably use it yourself. And more important, to say, well, we are here to actually collaborate with you, because if you do want to use this in your own setting, then we would love to actually come in and help you do it, right? So first things first, I guess, what I think Keong actually showed you is that in a single click in his EHR system, which is EPIC, which I know is not just UCL, but a lot of other people also use, you can, in a single click, bring up the appropriate trials for a patient who's literally in front of you. Now, I think that's really something that actually makes a difference. And personally, for me, that is why I'm actually involved in this work. Right? The second thing that I think Keong did not explain is it actually took him 20 minutes to configure that connection between EPIC and the platform that we built. I did not do it. So Keong, yes, of course, I'm sure a lot of you know, is technically quite capable, but it actually only took him 20 minutes to configure that connection that goes from the EHR all the way to key trials. And that is the beauty of it, because we used a standard which allows us to do that integration relatively quickly. Now, EPIC comes with that standard also, and that's how we were able to do it. Now, when somebody makes these claims that says, oh, it's all easy peasy, I think lots of people say, well, okay, I want to know, right? So let's actually then go through what it is that we were showing you. So first thing is relatively simple. You take all your existing trials, and like most people, oops, hang on, this is a bit strange. Sorry. You can stick a web interface on top of it. Technology nowadays is just relatively simple. Any software developer can do this. It's not really that hard. Okay, so that one's easy part. Now, what is the other part is you take your local EHR system and you connect it with the trial system, right? And that is actually the hard one. Why is it hard? It's really hard because most of clinical trials have their eligibility criteria, which we are really interested in. They're actually uncoded. The free text, gender and age may be possible, but the actual conditions, treatment options are not coded up, right? Whereas we know at least some parts of EHR is actually coded up. It uses SNOMED, ICD, something else. And we definitely have structured data around gender and age. Now, what did we have to do? In order to actually integrate these two things, we had to rely on something, sorry, it's a bit annoying because I have got these things popping up on my screen, and I've actually got this thing that actually obstructs my view of the slide. But so what we had to do, and the way we had to solve the problem, is to use natural language processing. We sometimes also refer to it in this slide as annotation, but it's essentially the same technology that everybody now seems to be talking about. All right. So how exactly did we do it? 3 steps broadly. First, take all your clinical studies, put them into a platform. Second, take all your clinical studies and annotate them using a standard terminology. In our case, we use SNOMED. And then third, you build the integration between your EHR to these annotated trials in the platform, right? So let's go through these steps. First thing, what is this platform? Our platform is called Key Trials. And I think as Keong demonstrated, we started up with informatics principles, but what also sits behind it is an open source technology that powers most modern technologies, most modern enterprises. So we use the same technology that Netflix, Amazon use, and of course it's built on the new cool tech that is out there as well. Okay. More importantly, what we try to do is to build the key integration points using standards, not custom integrations, so that we could integrate with EHRs, we could also integrate with local trial registries, all right? So if we just do a really high-level dummies version of here's what this thing actually looks like, that's basically Key Trials platform. It's got a user interface, it's got a backend, as you can imagine, and it's got a database. And on the other side, we have what is the UCL Edge Trials Registry system, and they, in their case, use Edge, which I think I'm told apparently 60 to 80% of all of the country actually uses. So that's good. On the integration side, what we did is we knew definitely we had to pull all these trials back into Key Trials. So we built an integration there. Okay. Now, on the other side, we had the EHR system, which is Epic, and we built the integration there. In order to do this, we used InfoButton. In order to do these annotation part, we used SNOMED CT. And of course, we use something which is some of you are familiar with, which is called a terminology server. Having built all these pieces, we were easily able to create a mobile app because all this information is accessible using something called REST APIs. And when you expose a platform and its data openly using REST APIs, you can actually consume it easily in a mobile app. Okay, so let's start with the first one. Local trials registry. Okay, it would be perfect if somebody had said every trial that is out there and every trial registry system will always expose data in the same format, but we know the world's not perfect. So in our case, we have to deal with what we had, and Epic, in fact, at least allows us to export all of its data in a text delimited format. So we batch imported all of it, right? So we keep doing these bulk imports every week. And in fact, actually, the way we've written it, I think UCLH manage it on their own. Okay. There's a problem here because it'd be great if every trials system would actually do this in the same way, but there are no standards for it. So we can't help that. What would have been nice is if we had actually gone and said, right, we've built it, could everybody else use it? But I don't think we've got the power to do it. Okay. Now, beyond that, because Epic is so prevalent across the UK, we believe that our work is actually useful, which means if you've got a system, sorry, if you've got a hospital.
Sorry to interrupt. Yeah. I think you mean Edge rather than Epic when you're talking about that.
Yes, Edge. Yes, sorry, yep, Edge. So Edge is so prevalent across the UK that if you actually use Edge to manage your clinical trials, you should be able to reuse our work. Now, as you can imagine, importing what probably years worth of data into a new platform always exposes data quality issues. We did come across our fair share of duplicate fields, incomplete data, but that is not the point of this conversation. So we're actually going to skip that bit, right? Okay, so having imported all the data, the next challenge was to take all these clinical trials and make them coded. And in order to code these or annotate them, we had a few choices. And most people can imagine, you got SNOMED CT, you got ICD, and there's also this other thing called mesh, and it's got a very sad face against it. Because I hope the one thing that people will take away from this presentation is do not try to use mesh to annotate your data. Okay, and I don't think it supports the kind of functionality that we would want to build for a modern system. It's great for what it was, but it's not great for what we would want to do. And I'll explain why. So people then say, well, why did you, sorry, I'm just going to move because my light's gone off. Okay. So people then say, why did you choose SNOMED? Why not something else? I think there are two reasons why we chose SNOMED. The first one is the intuitive search results, which is kind of what Keong was demonstrating to you earlier, because search is based on meaning and relationships, not really on text. Second is the coverage. We know SNOMED covers a lot more of clinical medicine than ICD alone would do, and we know clinical trials deal with interventions and drugs. All right. So if we just pick the first bit, right? So this is exactly a slightly different example of what Keong was showing you. If I were to actually then say, take SNOMED, and if I were looking for the word plasma cell disorders, I would definitely get back in key trials, I would get back multiple myeloma. Now, the way it would work, although there is no match between plasma cell disorders and multiple myeloma, is because within SNOMED, they would actually have some relationship. And that is what key trials uses to bring back matching results. It worked the same way across acute and chronic leukemias, anything else you can imagine. Okay. Now, how would this actually happen behind the scenes? So if you took key trials as a platform, obviously it's got a database backend, it's got a search API. If people then, for example, in this case, selected peripheral T-cell lymphoma as something that they were interested in, the first thing we do is we send it to our terminology server, and that terminology server knows SNOMED. And what it does is it goes and says, hey, within SNOMED, can you give me all types of peripheral T-cell lymphomas? And in there, you could have something very rare like Leonard's lymphoma, for example. This list from this terminology server is actually passed back to that search API, and the search API very simply uses those codes to retrieve the trials that actually contain that match. So that's broadly how the technology works. Okay, of course we are simplifying it, but the code is out there. If you guys want to look at it, you can always look at it at any point. Right now, if you've done that, and again, this is just a slightly different example because I think when we were recently doing this demonstration, I had this crazy idea that, well, what if I went and typed in viral disease, right? This is a different interface. So when I did that, I actually started to find that there are actually SARS-CoV-2 related trials that are actually showing up here because, believe it or not, SNOMED knows that CoV-2 is actually some sort of viral disease, and that's how you actually get this. Okay, again, showing that you didn't have to pre-code all of these. You didn't have to do any code changes as in software code changes. You could just use the power of SNOMED and actually just get some of the knowledge for free. Okay. Second reason why we did this is because we knew the coverage for clinical trials is broader than SNOMED. So we certainly used natural language processing. In our case, we only do it for conditions, as in diseases and disorders. But we knew in the future we would want to, extend it for interventions, products, and other things as well, right? So how does that part of the functionality work? So how does it actually work? How does it actually know that a trial has got this word or something called, lung cancer or non-small cell lung cancer? It works because when we load all the data into KeyTrials platform, we have what is a annotation API. So what it does, every time you trigger this API, you pass the trial title. That's all we're doing at the moment, by the way. We're not actually passing the entire text. We just pass the title of the trial into an NLP engine. So of course, I can't ask questions live here, but generally, if I was doing in a presentation and in a live room, I would ask people to show me, how many people have heard of GATE, which is the NLP engine built by Sheffield University, and BioUD, which is actually a really cool NLP engine that they built as part of it. For people who are probably not familiar, if you heard of CogStack also uses BioUD, by the way. So what we did is we send all this information to BioUD, which then, believe it or not, it gives us ICD-10 codes, which we then pass through our terminology server. And that translates those ICD, well, actually it's not ICD-10 codes, it's UMLS codes. It then translates them back into SNOMED CT. And these codes that we get, we put them back into the databases and we annotate every trial to say, this trial has now got this particular code. And that is how we actually annotate all trials. What we did not get a chance to demonstrate, and we won't probably do, is in fact, there is an ability for a user, an experienced user like Keong, for example, to actually then look at these results, and they can then say, right, you are thinking that this trial has got this condition, but actually NLP engine, you're wrong. So I will reject you or I'll accept you. All right. So in fact, you can actually manually do this. So what we do is we do a batch annotated process, which is automated entirely. Right. Okay. So what we showed you is how we suck in trials from a local registry into the platform. Then we showed you how we actually take all these trials and then we do NLP on them to actually annotate them, right? So the third part is then exposing them at the point that it actually matters, which is the point of care, right? There are three things that we at the moment take into account. The first is the diagnosis, second is the age, and the third is gender. I think Keong's demonstration of that Anna Blue Whale kind of demonstrates this very well anyway. So I talked about SNOMED, but there is a second standard that we use here, which is called the info button standard. This is a really simple standard. So I'm not about to do a crash course on it, but it's useful to just understand how it works, right? It's broadly used for people who want to access external knowledge bases or references. So it's used for looking at guidelines, it's used for looking at drug syntaxes, doses, medication alerts, yada, yada. That's what people generally seem to be using it for. But what it does, it allows you to build a URL to actually standardize how you can access knowledge bases. So what we did is we said, well, we've got these annotated corpus or collection of trials. How about we turn all these into a knowledge resource? So in some ways, we kind of took the HL7 info button standard, we kind of hacked it to make our actual trials behave like knowledge resources so that people could access them from an EHR, right? So what would that URL and those parameters look like? So very trivial example. So if you took, and we all see these in our browsers, so again, no crash course here, but if you took this strange looking characters and this URL that you're seeing, you can imagine this bit after the question mark is actually what is called a URL. It's called a query parameter. In this case, there are two of them, age, VU and age VV, right? And the values for this are actually these two things. So for this guy is A is the value and V is 78 is the value for this guy. Why am I talking about this? Because this is actually how HL7 info button standard works. It says if you got a predefined query parameter, okay, not the value, query parameter, you can actually always behave in a predictable manner. So it actually then defines what those parameters could be. Okay, so we're just showing you the ones that are relevant. In our case, it's always a search criteria, which is really important. Of course, you want the gender, you want the age, and just to show that there is more in HL7 info button, I was just showing the context also. For anybody who's a guru and HL7 V3, you would know exactly what this means and all the other things that go with that code. Yeah. Okay. So what would this actually then look like in a real world in our setting? So this is what it would look like. If I took this horrible looking thing, by the way, nobody's asking you to generate this by hand, we'll come to that. But if you look at this horrible looking thing, it actually splits it up into two parts. So there's an age rated bit, okay, and there's the actual search criteria or the diagnosis related bit. All right. Now, what on earth does any of this mean? All that translates to is it translates into a very simple thing saying, give me all matching trials for a patient who's of age 78, who has an ICD diagnosis of lung cancer. So that is actually the ICD-10 diagnosis for lung cancer. Okay, right. How does it all then fit in? Obviously, Keong was not going and generating all these by hand. So what happens is in Epic, when Keong actually says, okay, I right-click the patient and get me active guidelines, behind the scenes, this is what Epic actually builds because it actually supports info button for a different reason, right? So this is what we configured. It only took us 15 minutes to configure this to be generated. What we then do is we pass this info button query to the info button API that we built in KeyTrails platform, right? So once it's done, it does a query, boom, you get back the results that match that particular query. And of course, we then display it back into Epic within the same tab or a new tab. So all that just works. And the user is none the wiser because they actually don't need to know all of this works. Now, here's the beautiful part. Because it's built on a standard, it can also work on systems that comply to the info button standard. So for example, we're told that Cerner also complies with the info button standard. So you could actually have exactly the functionality working in Cerner if you've got Cerner in your, in your hospital. Okay. But before we go down that route, I think it'd just be useful to share some of these experiences now. It's really, really nice to actually say it was all very smooth, but we really did go through, some pain, and I think it actually took us longer than we originally intended. Part of it, I think, is because there are actually no real standards to do this sort of thing with clinical studies. Okay. Yes, there are lots of people who will say, well, hang on, what about CDAs? What about every other standard that is imaginable in clinical trials? Let's be very honest, those standards are actually around the process of clinical trial recruitment and some of the things that go in it. They don't actually cover what is to do with the clinical trial and the specification of the trial itself. The only thing that seems to come kind of close is CDISC-ODM, but even that doesn't quite reflect all the sort of eligibilities that we are looking for. Second, the thing that seems to kind of go into this space relatively newly, interestingly, is the HL7 fire standard. And I'm sure people here know all about fire, but there is actually one resource called the research study resource. It's immature. I think if the last I checked, it had a maturity level of 0 or 1, which means, it's really, really under development. But what we did is we said, well, if we got all this platform that can do all these cool, busy things, how could we expose all these trials into fire? And what would they look like? And that is basically the URL that you can go check it out. Just so you know, there's lots of gaps in the standard, which means obviously it's still in development. And so we haven't actually been able to do everything we want to do. But we'll come back to this one. Second is, remember I mentioned NLP. So we use NLP to actually annotate all our trials. Now, it was great to actually see that some of these things can be matched without us having to do anything. But we also found there's lots of room for improvement for some of these engines, NLP engines that we were using. And the reason is not to point out that the engines themselves were faulty, just because I don't think they have ever been trained on clinical trials domain. So what we started to do was to, essentially get back in touch with the people who built BioYOD and the other NLP engines and say, we would like to work with them. And I think this is where we would also like to see if anybody from the faculty would be interested in doing this sort of thing. But again, all the thought. Third part, controversial. Just so you know, I do generally make my living out of SNOMED and selling SNOMED, healthcare standards. But what we found is the world is not quite ready for SNOMED native use. In EPIC as well, it turns out that you can get SNOMED, but you have to do a couple of jumps, maybe 1 jump or 2 jumps before you actually get to the SNOMED code. So in fact, the way we've coded it up is we use ICD-10 codes because that seems to be easier to get from EPIC. And that's how we actually then use to generate our matches. So our trials are annotated in SNOMED, but we get ICD-10 codes from EPIC, and we do this sort of reverse lookup from ICD to SNOMED. And anybody here who knows how more granular SNOMED is compared to ICD will say, well, hang on, Jay, that sounds a bit fishy. You're going to lose meaning, right? Of course you would lose meaning, but except in our use case, it doesn't matter because we're actually just looking for any trials that this patient is eligible for. Right. So again, knowing the informatics is important because if you did not know informatics, you would just assume it would all work, but it's not. But this use case, it works, which is great, right? But again, we're here to say, I think as more and more SNOMED gets used, I think we won't have to go through these various hoops and we just start to get much better results, right? Okay. At this point, I generally pass back to Keong because I think he's probably best placed to say, how does this matter and what's actually changed? Keong, you happy to take over?
Yes.
Or do you want me to do this as well?
No, that's fine. I'll do this. So we've implemented Find a Study based on key trials about a year ago at UCLH. So there's increased visibility of what's going on at UCLH. We could of course do this on any kind of organization or who's ready for it, but it's obviously easier because I work there to get engagement in trying to do this. And I think the last point is actually quite important. Now we've demonstrated how something as simple as the info button standard can be used for this purpose. I think to be transparent, we've not actually implemented this in the live system yet. And this is not a technology problem so much so, just that as Jay says, the NLP annotation of clinical trials is not perfect. And it probably needs a manual process to actually do it unless, of course, we get the NLP working much better. But that was beyond kind of the funding of the first stage of this project that we've done. So, it is an open source project. Jay can point you to the URL. The other thing we've done for COVID is that the Shelford group was quite keen to spin up an instance of key trials. I mean, they initially wanted a website like most do, but say actually UCLH is a member of the Shelford group. Let's just make let's just take key trials and as a platform, and we created a COVID-19 specific instance of it, and that's available on the internet. As well, we've also looking for opportunities to get the natural language processing better for clinical trials, and so looking for various funding opportunities to do that. So this is just a screenshot of what we did for the Shelford group. So I think this bit is important to ensure where we're coming from. So the vision is for this to be a collaborative endeavor. So every new partner that wants to implement this will contribute to it for either as development or ideas. We're really keen that this was built on enterprise-grade software. So that it can scale from thousands to millions of trials quite easily, and that this is built on clinical informatics principles. And then the other thing, just to be transparent, so UCLH BRC has funded all the development of this and therefore owns the IP, even if it's open source for the platform. Jay's company was commissioned to do this. So even though they don't own the IP per se, they developed this, and we pay them to provide support for the platform for final study at UCLH. How you can contribute? Well, you can contribute via the standard kind of open source way of doing so. And the next one is an interesting one. So as Jay says, there is a way of improving natural language processing annotation of clinical trials, but this needs people to kind of manually validate what the computer tells it, whether it's right or wrong. And by continuously training the model, it's a supervised learning AI machine learning model. It will get better and better at doing so. If you have an EHR and you want to have a go at doing this, that's great. For example, I think in the chat, some people have mentioned Cerner, and Cerner has a large footprint in the UK. And so I'll skip this slide because I think I'm quite keen to kind of go to the Q&A session. As I said, findastudy.ucl.nhs UK is our kind of live implementation of the study. There's also an app in the final stages of testing it before we kind of put it onto the usual places. These are our contact details. So please do get in touch, and I'm looking forward to the Q&A. So that's it.
Hopefully I'm off mute. Keong, Jay, thanks very much for that fascinating sort of answer to what I've seen as a real life problem that's been a long-standing problem in electronic health records. So great to hear of the solution there. And I've got a few questions, but I'll maybe just go to some of the questions that are in the chat first of all. And just to people, please also put your hand up. It forms a wee queue, and we'll come through that. But I think back at the beginning, we had a question originally from Alex Slonoki, if I've got that right. Hopefully, Alex just disappeared the question there. And Alex was asking, is there any search functionality based on attributable relationships in SNOMED using ECL?
Jay, I think maybe you take this one.
Yes, so really good question. So for people who don't understand it, they won't understand the answer. So the terminology server that we use is actually a full-fledged terminology, SNOMED CT terminology server. If we could actually use NLP and annotate trials using post-coordinated NLP, then yes, you would. But otherwise, you would be able to actually just send those queries. Remember, you can only use those attributes from ECL if actually you are creating those similar constructs in the trials themselves. Otherwise, you're just doing it just because of vanity, right? And I say this with the utmost respect because, as I said, I used to do SNOMED for a living for a long time in many countries. we're not quite there yet. The terminology server has got the ability. Does it answer the question? Maybe not, otherwise ping me offline.
Yeah, Alex, I mean, by all means, pitch in if you want to follow up on that, but hopefully that answers it, or you can pitch in the chat. Jay and Mike, I can maybe summarise. There's a couple of sort of questions people asking about, you know, Cerner, Epic, saying Cerner's used in other parts of North and South London, and what about smaller EHRs, other EHRs? Maybe just that, you know, thinking about the bigger picture around this and openness and standards. So I don't know who wants to take that question.
I'm happy to take this. So as Jay said, the integration we've done uses HL7 info button standards. So effectively, any EHR that can generate, if you like, that URL and allow and to display the, if you like, the URL within their EHR, we can integrate with. Of course, one of the big things is that you will need diagnoses recorded in your EHR in a structured manner. And we know that it's both a technology and people and a process issue, that even if you have a very advanced EHR, a lot of people are not recording the diagnoses in a structured way. And what I mean is the clinicians recording the diagnosis rather than the coders doing it in the kind of post-inpatient admission situation, because obviously by then the patient has already left the hospital. And as we know, outpatient episodes are not coded by coders because they're not captured for kind of commissioning purposes. So I hope that answers the question. We know Cerner definitely supports HL7 info button. So I think if there was somebody working at a Cerner site who want to kind of have a go at doing this, you know, please do get in touch. And I'm sure other EHRs have the same as well.
Jay, anything you want to add in on that?
Nope, I think we were just trying to say that if you got an HL7 info button compliant system already, and you got, you know, Edge actually already in your hospital, which then you could just use this. That's what we were saying. We were not trying to, you know, preempt or exclude anybody. Small vendors, if they want to build a functionality, perfect. We would love to work with them.
Am I right in thinking that, you know, I suppose in some ways your overall message here is to encourage anyone use these standards, these international standards, and that brings you into the game? Is that?
That's right.
Exactly. Yeah. And depending on how key trials go, I mean, as Jay says, the info button standard was created for, I think, what was the word that you used? Something to do with knowledge resources, right? In theory, you know, key trials can be a lot more advanced than just a knowledge resource. And so I guess if there is opportunity in the future and appropriate funding and opportunities, we would like to do different types of integrations. For example, like a Smart on Fire app or things like that. Yeah.
Okay. Excellent, guys. So hopefully that's answered that question. But colleagues, please, you know, do pitch into the chat if you want. There's been another couple of questions. I think Marcella's come on. Marcella, you've put your question in the chat there, but you're online. You're welcome to just, you know, speak to us.
So, hi, excellent presentation, actually, guys. Really fantastic work. You know, I was really looking forward to seeing something like this, and here you are. So congratulations. So now it's the next level for us, because you probably know, I am from the northwest of London, and Cerner is the name of the game. And we just acquired a new platform that is called Power Trials. That is an appendix of Cerner. My question to you is, I think that using HL7, I think that you're absolutely right. That is the way to connect the data. But my question is, and my interest is linking the OPCS4 coding, because we use the diagnosis and we use procedures codes as well. And in Northwest London, and particularly in my trust, we recruit quite a lot of surgical patients into interventional studies. And in my long-term view on this is that we should be able to pick up patients at the point of first contact with surgeons, and then researchers can get into patients that meet criteria in the community and send the first information through Patient Knows Best, because that's an application that is interlinked. So have you thought about that? Because I think that will give us quite a full picture of the patient's journey through through the system, no, and capture. So.
So Jay, I don't know. You want to take the question about procedures? Yeah.
Yeah. So I think okay. So first of all, great question, and I think kind of ties into the vision that I always had, because in many ways I love medicine because I understand how the tech works. But what I did not tell you is I also work in the terminology field, so I know OPCS very well. So as I said, I'm a SNOMED geek. So the beauty of doing all of this is when you stick a terminology server behind the scenes, you can actually load everything else that you want in it. This is exactly why we picked Snowman. I would actually go a bit further to what you said. I think my ultimate vision is if we could get this NLP thing to work, we should be able to expose these trials using something like a modern standard like FHL-7 so that even a GP could actually pick it up. Correct. Patient knows best. They're an app. They can integrate into this. We should be able to cover the entire spectrum of how this works. And then we know there are code mappings. There are actually maps from SNOMED to everything else, right? Yeah. NHS Digital, who I used to work with, actually published these. So we should be able to actually integrate all this nicely now. What I'll say to you is very cheekily, you give me the solution, you give me the problem, and we'll go and figure out how we can actually make this work, right? And if you can actually say, here you go, here's the people in Cerner who could actually work with you, that's exactly what we need to move this to the next level.
Okay, so I probably will do that because I got the team, and I think that this is a very smart move because you are linked with the NIHR as well, and one of the annoying things.
Yeah, about the NIHR, we link kind of a little bit indirectly, in the sense that. And in the sense that, BRCs are funded by the NIHR and the UCLH BRC funded this project rather than this being a centrally NIHR funded thing, if that makes sense.
But I think that moving forward, you need to think seriously making this the standard platform and integrating platform for all the research across the country. Because, I don't know if you heard of Trinex. Trinex is an American company that use the same process and the same language in your word, Jay, to capture diagnosis at the point of entry of a patient in hospital. And it's pretty much a private platform that you paid for, and they will search and populate the inclusion criteria and then attract the industry, and commercial studies. So there are people working on this. So I think that you can make it smarter. I think that you are in the, we need something like this now. It's perfect.
So let's have a chat. We want to do this, and we want to do this for NHS actually. So
yes, that would be fantastic.
I mean, that was another question I had, guys. Just in a general sense, is this something that you can maybe encourage NIHR, apologies, to make sure that all of their trials are coded with SNOMED coding? So that I appreciate you've got the NLP, but is to encourage the research community out there the opportunity by using the coding to make sure they find homes for their trials much easier.
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting point, Paul. So we spoke to sorry, his name suddenly escapes me, but he's a clinical informatician at Southampton who runs Edge. And he had the vision that he was really keen that when people register their clinical studies on Edge, that they at least attach some form of code to it. And so they built in a functionality so that you could do ICD-10 tagging, if you like, of studies. He found it really, really hard to encourage people to do it. And I think part of it is that it is to do with, okay, if I've done it, so what, right? And I guess it's a little bit of a vicious cycle. So if the so what is, if you've done this, we could be better at matching eligibility criteria to patients and have something to demonstrate that value, then people are more inclined to put in that additional effort. I have to say at UCLH, and we haven't really pursued this because of kind of distractions of COVID and other things, but the R&D department have really been quite engaged with this process. And I think they wouldn't mind doing this going forward for all new studies that will be joined for us to actually tag them locally, at least at UCLH. But that's a good point. To have that conversation around, effectively is less more about tagging diagnosis. It's about having computable eligibility criteria for studies, right? That's what it is effectively.
Yeah.
And a diagnosis is just another form of eligibility criteria. Yep.
Thanks, Wicket.
Yep.
We've got a few minutes left, folks, and there's one question in there about putting up the last slide, if that's possible, to get your contact details. I don't know why, Keong and Jay, if these slides are available by PDF, just for members.
I think Joe was going to put it on later.
So
yeah.
We can get that out to people, but also this whole webinar will then be on the series of webinars through the faculty website, so we can look back at anything on there as well. If I can maybe. I don't think we've missed any other points that people have raised, but one other final point is maybe just over to yourself, to the faculty audience here. What would you see as key points where faculty members could collaborate with you?
It's a good question. So I think if you know colleagues, I suppose, who are interested in the clinical trial standards space, I think that is one area I think is slightly underdeveloped at the moment in this country. So I know that Neil Sabir, who is the Chief Data Officer for HDR UK, I talk to him quite a bit because obviously we are not far from each other in terms of the hospitals we work with. This is an area I think HDR UK might be quite interested to, because of course they deal with the kind of EHR data. So they're very keen on how you kind of get the research potential from it, and just not data research, but also clinical trials. So this is, I think, one area that I think if we have a good critical mass of people, we could create a slight community around this and start pushing it forward. So I think that's one area. The second area is around the NLP. We have a few people interested in doing kind of the gold standard annotation for so you do interventions, diagnosis, and stuff on a set of clinical trials. I think so. If people are interested, I guess, to learn more about the NLP technology in general, and then maybe contribute as effectively annotators, that's another way to get involved.
Okay, and
there's a third part, I guess, as well. Actually, so. I mean, personally, I guess I can take all these, all these other things. But one thing I think actually could happen, and I think people in the faculty are actually probably passionate as well, is to expose the same trials. Every trial that happens in every hospital or trust can actually be exposed. Now, forget SNOMED, forget HL7 info button. All you need to do is download this damn thing. Sorry to swear, but actually just download it. If you got Epic, right? You just can import all your trials, and you can then expose all your trials outside to the rest of the world. I know that is actually just a cultural change. Just that cultural change of sharing everything you're doing is actually significant enough. And I'm sure Viking will tell you that also changes perceptions, because then you start engaging with clinicians who say, right, I never knew this trial was running in our hospital, to a patient saying, I found this trial. How can I participate? That I think is the real value of something like this.
Excellent. No, that's a very good point, and I appreciate the cultural changes required to open up. But then, if small opportunities show the value of that are enormous. Guys, can I thank you? One final point. There's a point in the chat there from Edge. Please ask the Edge team to generate codes for every trial register and feedback to SNOMED. So that chat's all there, and we'll make sure that's shared with JMY Keong, and it's there in the video. So can I thank you both for your time and the presentation? I think it's an excellent topic. It's excellent work. It's been sort of long coming, and I hope you managed to spurn this out into other projects and other areas, encompass all the parts of the NHS, and faculty members are now aware of this, and we can assist in any way, and hopefully that's opened up some dialogue. So thank you very much for your time, colleagues, and I'll let everyone carry on with the rest of their day.
Thank you for the opportunity.
Thanks, guys. Brilliant. Cheers. Thanks for the opportunity. Bye-bye.
Top class. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Marcella. Bye now.